to this, the first of our 2022 Lenten video message series put together by pastors from across the Homer City Area Ministerium. I'm Steve Bond, the pastor at Hope Lutheran Church in Homer City, as well as the pastor at New Life Lutheran Church in Marion Center. And it's our privilege this Lent to share with you reflections of our own as pastors and leaders in congregations here in our Homer City area community that we hope will invite you into deeper reflection and closer relationship with the God we've come to know in Jesus. There are so many different ways people might observe or mark this season of Lent. There are some who rigorously have days that they will change their diet, fasting, they'll pray differently, they'll gather for additional times of worship or Bible study. There will be the intentional focus time for devotional or quiet time. There will be those who intentionally seek out ways they can serve their neighbors or show kindness to other people in this season. Sometimes it's just an intentional reflection on what God did for us in Jesus at the cross and resurrection. Any of those are helpful tools, ways for us to be drawn more deeply into the story of the God who meets us in the cross and resurrection. And this year, as the pastors of the ministerium got together, we thought it might be a good place to start to this year invite you to reflect on what are sometimes called the 7 last words from the cross. Across all 4 of the Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are sayings, things Jesus says even while he's dying on the cross. And we wanted to take a chance with each of these videos in our series to feature one, spend a moment reflecting on it, thinking on it, and then to let that lead us in our action and living and reflection in our daily lives. So we invite you not just to watch this video, but to be a part of this entire series. And of course, at the end of Lent, to join us for our annual in-person crosswalk on Good Friday across our Homer City community as we go from place to place across our Homer City community, both carrying a cross and singing hymns of the faith that are centered on Holy Week and Jesus' death and resurrection, and also taking moments along the way to pause and to reflect on Christ's death for us. So, to begin this series, I want to invite you to, for a moment, just pause, set aside whatever else you're doing. I know we live in a time where it's easy to multitask, and there's a video over here, and I'm reading a book and cooking something on the stove at the same time. But for a moment, just pause. Let's start with the first of the words from the cross. This version is taken from Mark's Gospel. You can find it in the 15th chapter. Verses 33 and 34. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Those are difficult words. It's short, but boy, those are difficult words. And if I can be honest with you, pastor to people, of all the things that we hear from Jesus' mouth at the cross, for an awful lot of my life, this was the hardest of them for me to make any sense of, the one I least wanted to hear. I'm all for the later ones that come on the list. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's beautiful. The peacefulness of, into your hands I commend my spirit. There's beautiful things there, but this first anguished cry of dereliction, of feeling absolutely God-forsaken from the cross, it sends shivers down my spine to this day, and it makes me uncomfortable. But I have to be honest, I think sometimes we need that discomfort. I think we need that maybe more than we care to admit. If anything, Lent is the church's way of saying to us, sometimes we need to be made uncomfortable so that we can hear a word of good news that we'd gotten too numb or apathetic to hear in the first place. And this is one of those moments. If I can be particularly honest with you, I think for a lot of my life, when I heard this part of the story, Jesus crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I think I automatically pictured that as God is up there somewhere, Jesus with all of us human beings who have to go through things like suffering and death are down here, and that there's this barrier between, and that here we're down here, God's up there, and how terrible it is that Jesus feels God forsaken. And it always put this terrible fear into me. Well, what if I find myself feeling God forsaken? What could I do to have God abandon me? What would I do to get God's attention again? And very quickly I find myself panicking or feeling miserable, like God is distant, and that if Jesus, even Jesus, the Son of God, the very Savior and Messiah, if Jesus could feel God forsaken, well, my goodness, there's no hope for me. Of course, some point in my life, I'm going to be abandoned by God too. I think for a lot of my life, I heard this story as the warning. If it happened to Jesus, you too will feel God forsaken as well. Get ready. I don't think that anymore. And I think the reason is the more and more I spend time in the story of the scriptures, the more and more I reflect on what it is we confess about Jesus, that he's not merely interesting religious teacher or human moral example, but God's own presence with us. If Jesus really is God in the flesh, like the New Testament writers stake their lives on, if Jesus is really what it looks like when God enters into a human life with flesh and bone and body, if Jesus really is the embodiment of God among us, God with us, Emmanuel, like we sing about and speak about at Christmas time, if that's true, then Jesus is what it looks like when God is willing even to go into God-forsaken places. And at this point, it's like our language falls apart. It's like our very human words fall apart, because it's like saying at the cross, God goes into the place where God isn't. God goes into God-forsakenness. God bears that brokenness and that heartache, that feeling of absence for us and with us, so that we aren't alone in it anymore. The cross isn't really about Jesus being abandoned. It's about God refusing to abandon us, even a whole world full of us stinkers and sinners, even a whole world that is so often turned dead set away from God. The cross is God's choice to say, I will enter even into God-forsaken places with you. And in that sense, Jesus echoes this long-standing, rich tradition, even from what we sometimes call the Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures, that there's nowhere God isn't, that there's nowhere you can be that is absent from God's presence. There's nowhere you can be where God isn't, even in the valley of the shadow of death, even in the realm of the grave. Right? So the psalmist can say things like, where could I flee from your presence? If I go to the top of the tallest mountain, there you are. If I go to the far side of the sea, there you are. Even if I make my bed in the realm of the dead, in Sheol, the Hebrew word for the realm of the dead, even if I go to the grave, there you are. Or the famous words of Psalm 23, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want, right? Even when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I won't fear. Why? Because you're with me. So even there, when Jesus cries, I feel abandoned, right? At the very same moment of Jesus feeling abandoned by God, at the very same time, Jesus is God in the flesh going into the place of God-forsakenness. There is nowhere you can go that God isn't there with you and for you. If God's willing to bear a cross for us, not simply to send somebody else to bear pain, but if God steps into that place of death, if God steps into the torture of a cross, if God's the one who bears that, there is nowhere God won't go for you. There is nowhere God hasn't gone already for you. There is nothing God will not do or bear for you from here on out. That's amazing, and that's good news. So I want to ask you in these days, when sometimes it can feel like there are God-forsaken corners all over our world, as we hear on the news about another war unfolding and engulfing nations in Europe, as we are mindful of people in our own communities, families, neighborhoods who are dealing with really difficult diagnoses, the terminal cancer diagnosis, the chronic illness that won't go away, the complications in a pregnancy, the difficulty of somebody with dementia or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease, the reality of COVID and those who we have lost or those who are still suffering with lingering effects. The people who have lost their jobs, don't have prospects, and all the time we are faced with people in our own lives and around us who feel that God-forsakenness. In those places when it really can feel like, where are you, God? Why have you abandoned me? The story of Jesus on the cross doesn't speak a word of despair, as if God's saying, yep, you're on your own. But the word from the cross is that God even goes into God-forsaken places. If God can show up in the human body of Jesus, bleeding out on a cross, even in a place of utter God-forsakenness, and yeah, God shows up in your and my dark valleys. God shows up when you and I are the ones who feel like we're in the place of God-forsakenness. Whatever else comes your way, this day, this week, this season of Lent, this lifetime, no, there is nowhere you and I can go that is beyond the reach of a God who even goes into the God-forsaken places. Blessings to you and yours this Lent, and we invite you to join us along next week as we continue walking through the 7 words from the cross. Christ's peace.
My God, my God, my God, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far away from my groaning, my God?